It was the winter of 1949 when the quiet laboratories of post-war America began to hum again, not with celebration, but with fear. Just 4 years after Hiroshima, the Soviet Union detonated its first atomic bomb over the Kazakh steppe, and the mushroom cloud that rose above Semipalatinsk sent a tremor through every corridor of the Pentagon. For the first time since the war, the United States was no longer alone in its terrible power. In Washington, generals spoke of the balance of terror. In Los Alamos, the physicists who had once created the bomb were asked to imagine what came next. The question was simple, yet chilling: if the enemy could strike at any moment, how could America strike back, instantly, endlessly, without warning? The idea that took hold seemed to belong to another world. What if a bomber could remain in the sky for days, even weeks, circling silently above the clouds, immune to fuel shortages or refueling bases that could be destroyed in a first strike? What if its engines were driven not by kerosene, but by the limitless heat of a nuclear reactor? Such a craft, they argued, could make deterrence absolute, a plane that never landed, armed with weapons that never slept. It would be the ultimate expression of the Cold War's dark logic, peace through the promise of annihilation. Inside the newly formed Aircraft Nuclear Propulsion Program, engineers from General Electric and the Atomic Energy Commission gathered sketches of reactors no larger than an automobile engine, yet powerful enough to melt steel. They called it nuclear air-breathing propulsion. Air would be sucked in at high speed, funneled through a reactor core heated to thousands of degrees, and blasted out the tail as pure thrust. In theory, it was simple. In practice, it was madness. The reactor's exhaust would be radioactive, its maintenance lethal, its shielding impossibly heavy. Yet the climate of 1950 America left no room for hesitation. The Soviet threat was growing, and the Air Force demanded answers that bordered on the impossible. At Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, early prototypes took shape on drafting tables lined with slide rules and coffee-stained notebooks. Physicists debated how to protect the crew from the invisible fury behind their backs. They calculated lead thicknesses, airflow velocities, neutron flux densities, all leading to the same conclusion: to protect the pilots was to doom the plane, and to save the plane was to doom the pilots. Still, the work continued. Billions were allocated. Laboratories expanded across Idaho, Ohio, and New Mexico. Nuclear engines were no longer fantasy, they were classified projects with code numbers, deadlines, and lives on the payroll. For the men involved, the mission carried both pride and dread. They saw themselves as pioneers standing on the edge of a new era, the atomic age of flight. Yet each breakthrough exposed a new danger. Tests with dummy reactors produced radiation spikes that burned paint from hangar walls. Airflow experiments showed that even a minor leak could spread contamination for miles. Reports were marked secret and filed away, but the risks grew harder to ignore. One engineer later recalled that every success felt like pulling a tiger closer by its tail. Outside the chain-link fences of those test sites, the public heard nothing. The newspapers spoke of peacetime prosperity, of cars with tail fins and televisions in every home, while in the desert a new kind of engine was being forged, one that could, in a single malfunction, poison the earth it was built to defend. Still, the promise of limitless power was irresistible. If nuclear submarines could cross oceans without surfacing, why not aircraft that could patrol the skies forever? The world, they believed, would sleep safer knowing America had such guardians overhead. It was a faith born of fear, and it would lead them down a path from which there could be no easy return. For now, the dream remained just that, a dream written in blueprints and budget memos, still untouched by the heat of its own ambition. But deep in the Nevada desert, survey teams were already marking ground for a facility unlike any other, a place where the air itself would soon turn radioactive. The project had no name yet. Only a promise whispered in conference rooms, that with enough science, enough courage, and enough disregard for consequence, mankind could teach the atom to fly. By the mid-1950s, the Cold War had hardened into a permanent condition, an invisible front stretching from Berlin to the Bering Sea. Air raid drills became routine in American schools, sirens wailed across cities whose citizens lived under the thin comfort of duck and cover. Every speech from Moscow seemed to promise new rockets, new bombers, new threats. To the men inside the Pentagon, the balance of power felt like a clock forever ticking toward midnight. They were haunted by a single nightmare, a Soviet first strike that could wipe out every American air base before the bombers ever left the ground. In such a war, survival would belong only to what could already fly. President Eisenhower's administration responded with a mixture of optimism and desperation. The United States poured billions into long-range missiles, radar nets, and secret research contracts under the Atomic Energy Commission. Yet each success by the Soviets erased another illusion of safety. In 1955, the appearance of the Tu-95 Bear bomber, capable of carrying nuclear weapons to North America, shocked intelligence analysts. Within months, reports followed of Soviet progress on intercontinental ballistic missiles. The concept of mutually assured destruction was not yet formalized, but its logic was already dictating budgets, alliances, and the fevered tempo of innovation. Inside Air Force planning rooms, men with slide rules and steel-rimmed glasses drew lines across world maps. They spoke in acronyms, SAC, NORAD, AEC, and in tones of quiet urgency. Somewhere, they believed, there had to be a perfect deterrent, a weapon that could not be caught, a guardian that never slept. Conventional jet bombers could not provide that certainty. They were fast but hungry. Even the mighty B-52 needed refueling every few hours. Tanker bases in Europe and Alaska were vulnerable. A nuclear-powered aircraft, by contrast, could remain aloft for days or weeks, waiting patiently beyond the reach of any missile. To the theorists at RAND Corporation, it was the ultimate insurance policy, an airborne fortress that no enemy could disarm. The rhetoric of scientific triumph cloaked a growing unease. Physicists at Oak Ridge and Los Alamos knew the human cost hidden behind the equations. Shielding a reactor powerful enough to push a 20-ton aircraft required tons of lead, which in turn demanded more thrust, which demanded an even hotter reactor. Each solution created two new problems. A successful flight would leave a faint plume of radioactive particles across every mile it traveled. A crash would mean catastrophe. Yet within the calculus of nuclear deterrence, these risks were acceptable, at least on paper. If it keeps the peace, one general famously said, the fallout is worth it. As laboratories expanded and budgets ballooned, the public remained unaware of what their taxes were building. Newsreels spoke of jet-age optimism, of atomic energy lighting cities and powering submarines. Few realized that the same optimism had taken a darker turn in the desert. At test ranges in Idaho and Nevada, vast hangars rose among the sagebrush. Engineers arrived under security escorts, carrying notebooks stamped restricted data. The air buzzed with the sound of compressors and the faint metallic tang of ozone. From a distance it looked like any other government installation. Up close, it smelled of fear and ambition. The physicists who once celebrated splitting the atom for peace now found themselves caught in a paradox of their own making. They were asked to design a machine that could defend humanity by threatening its extinction, to make something so terrible that it would never need to be used. Some believed deeply in that logic, others avoided looking too closely at what it implied. Late at night, when the drafting rooms fell silent, they wondered whether history would remember them as saviors or as the men who tried to teach death to fly. By 1956, whispers circulated through Washington of a new phase in the project, something more radical than an airplane, more powerful than a bomber. A weapon that would not merely fly above the Earth, but burn a path through it. The Air Force wanted results, and the Atomic Energy Commission promised a demonstration that would silence every skeptic. In the coming years, deep in the Nevada desert, the dream of endless flight would take on a new name, Project Pluto. And with it, the world would cross another line it could never uncross. By 1957, the concept of a nuclear-powered aircraft had outgrown the paper stage and taken root in the laboratories of America's most secretive institutions. At General Electric's sprawling facility in Evendale, Ohio, and in the guarded compounds of Los Alamos, teams of physicists, metallurgists, and engineers labored over a challenge that bordered on the absurd: how to make the atom breathe. Every calculation led to the same wall of contradictions: airflow too turbulent, shielding too heavy, heat too intense, but the orders from above were unwavering. The Air Force wanted results, and failure was not an acceptable report. The basic problem lay at the heart of the design. A nuclear reactor could generate enormous heat, but it could not simply be contained, it had to be harnessed to thrust. The proposed solution was to use the air itself as coolant and propellant. Air would be rammed through an open reactor core, heated directly by fission, and expelled at supersonic speed. No fuel tanks, no combustion, just nuclear fire meeting the open sky. The idea was elegant in theory, catastrophic in reality. The exhaust would be laced with radioactive isotopes, leaving behind an invisible trail of contamination thousands of miles long. In the mathematical purity of the design, there was no place for human lungs, or forests, or oceans. Yet in the logic of deterrence, such concerns were secondary. What mattered was that the enemy would know this thing could fly and never stop. To solve the problem of weight, Los Alamos proposed a revolutionary reactor core made of ceramic uranium oxide arranged in a honeycomb lattice. It would be compact, heat-resistant, and capable of withstanding temperatures above 1,400 degrees Celsius. Engineers nicknamed it the Flying Crowbar, a nod to its crude efficiency and terrifying power. The only obstacle was physics itself. At those temperatures, ordinary metal softened like wax. Bearings seized, seals failed, instruments melted. Even the act of testing the materials required remote-controlled equipment, operated from bunkers behind thick glass and concrete walls. When technicians entered the chamber after a trial, their Geiger counters clicked like angry insects. Meanwhile, the issue of crew safety remained unsolved. Early drafts imagined a manned bomber with a heavily shielded cockpit suspended ahead of the reactor like a leaden bubble. Calculations showed that even with tons of protection, the pilots would still absorb fatal doses after several missions. Some suggested replacing humans entirely with automated guidance systems, but computers in the 1950s were too primitive, too large, too unreliable. To keep the dream alive, designers began to fantasize about remote operation, a plane guided by radio command, circling the planet like a ghost. Slowly, the concept drifted away from aviation and into something darker, a flying weapon with no pilot, no base, no recall signal. The deeper the scientists went, the more surreal their world became. Meetings began with discussions of aerodynamics and ended with debates about morality. Could they truly justify building an engine that poisoned the air it used to fly? Was this progress, or just a clever new way to end civilization? The answers depended on which room you asked. In Washington, Project Pluto was spoken of in the language of superiority and deterrence. In the labs, it felt more like a slow descent into madness disguised as research. And yet, for all its peril, the work was exhilarating. To many young physicists, this was the frontier, an engineering Everest that tested the limits of what the human mind could command from nature. They built prototypes, tested alloys, and scribbled formulas that shimmered like poetry under fluorescent light. Every failure brought them a fraction closer to what they called critical flight, the moment when the reactor would sustain itself in open air. By 1958, the project had consumed millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours. But despite the obstacles, progress was undeniable. The reactors were shrinking, the thrust projections rising. In internal memos, one phrase began to appear more frequently: operational feasibility approaching. Few noticed what those words truly meant. The impossible was becoming possible. And in the deserts of Nevada, surveyors began carving a flat expanse of land for what would soon become the most dangerous test facility on Earth, a place where the atom would finally learn to fly. By 1959, the dream of nuclear-powered flight was no longer confined to blueprints and blackboards. It had acquired shape, weight, and danger. Deep in the New Mexico desert, the first prototype reactor was assembled under the watch of Los Alamos engineers and military officers who spoke in clipped tones and carried dosimeters like wristwatches. The code name was Tori, short for thermal reactor. The first version, Tori IA, looked nothing like an engine. It was a squat, cylindrical core wrapped in pipes, valves, and shielding, ugly, unpainted, and lethally brilliant. Inside it lay over 500,000 fuel elements, each no larger than a pencil eraser, arranged in a honeycomb pattern to withstand the hellish airflow of a ramjet engine. The principle was simple enough for any student to understand, and terrifying enough for every scientist involved. Air would be forced through the reactor by massive compressors, heated to more than 1,300 degrees Celsius, and expelled at supersonic speed. The thrust would be immense. The reactor, however, would be completely exposed to the atmosphere. No containment dome, no filters, no protection, just raw nuclear fire blasting into open air. It was the very definition of reckless genius, a weapon that polluted simply by existing. But to the Pentagon, the promise of unlimited range outweighed every objection. If it flies, one colonel said, we win the next century. To bring Tori to life, engineers required a proving ground far from any city or prying eyes. The chosen site was a barren valley at the edge of the Nevada test site known as Jackass Flats, a name that would soon become infamous among those who worked there. Construction began in 1960, concrete bunkers, underground control rooms, and a network of pipelines capable of simulating the high-speed airflow of a missile in flight. They built a compressor facility the size of a factory, powered by jet engines salvaged from decommissioned bombers. When it ran, the desert shook, and the sound carried for miles. The scale of the operation was staggering. More than 1,000 technicians and scientists were involved, most of them unaware of what their work would ultimately build. To many, it was simply another Cold War research project, exotic, secret, but necessary. Yet among the senior engineers, the tension was palpable. They knew the consequences of failure. A burst fuel element, a stuck valve, a single miscalculation, and the desert could become an irradiated wasteland. The men in charge of safety carried the burden like a silent curse. In the spring of 1961, the first full-scale test was scheduled. The reactor, cooled and dormant, was hoisted onto its test stand. Cables snaked across the ground like veins, air hoses and monitoring lines converged on the control bunker half a mile away. At dawn, the desert was still. Then the compressors roared to life, filling the silence with a low, rising thunder. From behind leaded glass, the operators watched gauges climb. Neutron detectors flickered. The control rods began to withdraw, millimeter by millimeter. Within seconds, the core came alive. Observers described the moment as both mesmerizing and horrifying. Through periscope cameras, the reactor glowed a dull orange, then brightened to white. The air streaming through it hissed like a living thing. The entire test stand vibrated under the power. For a few fleeting minutes, humanity had achieved what seemed impossible, a functioning, air-breathing nuclear engine. It did not explode. It did not melt down. It worked. But the triumph was uneasy. The plume that poured from the exhaust carried particles no one wanted to measure. Radiation monitors spiked across the site, and for days afterward, Geiger counters crackled in the wind. The desert soil shimmered faintly in ultraviolet light, a thin dusting of invisible poison settling over the sagebrush. The official report was brief and triumphant. Reactor achieved sustained criticality and full power. Performance objectives met. Behind that sentence lay the weight of 1,000 unspoken fears. The test had proven that nuclear flight was possible, but not that it was survivable. To the men in the control room, the question was no longer whether the atom could be made to fly. It was whether anyone could live beneath its shadow. And yet, even as the data poured in, the Pentagon's appetite grew. The Air Force demanded a weapon worthy of this new engine, a machine that could carry destruction across continents without ever returning. The engineers at Jackass Flats were about to learn that what they had built was not an aircraft at all, but the beating heart of a monster. The Nevada desert was a place built for secrets. Vast, empty, and far from curious eyes, it was where America rehearsed for the end of the world. Atomic tests had already scarred the landscape with craters and glassy plains, but what was being constructed at Jackass Flats in 1961 was something different, a facility not meant to measure destruction, but to create it in motion. The base spread across 20 square miles of dust and silence. Concrete tunnels, exhaust trenches, and reinforced bunkers emerged like the bones of some buried creature being unearthed. At its center stood the testing complex for Project Pluto, surrounded by fences crowned with barbed wire and signs warning, "Danger, radioactive area." The men who worked there arrived before sunrise in unmarked buses, their badges coded by color rather than name. Each morning began the same way, dosimeter check, safety briefing, and a half-joking reminder that if the Geiger counter clicks faster than your heartbeat, start running. Most of them were engineers, mechanics, or technicians borrowed from General Electric or the Atomic Energy Commission, but a handful were soldiers, armed guards stationed to ensure no one spoke of what they saw. The entire operation was buried under layers of classification so thick that even senior staff could discuss their work only inside soundproof rooms. To the outside world, Jackass Flats was a high-temperature airflow experiment. In truth, it was the birthplace of a weapon that could turn continents into ash. The core of the facility was the Tory test cell, a reinforced chamber connected to a massive network of steel pipes leading to jet engine compressors several miles away. When the system ran at full power, it could blast a hurricane of superheated air into the reactor, simulating Mach 3 flight at sea level. No living thing could survive inside that cell while it operated. Temperatures soared beyond 1,300 degrees Celsius, and the roar was so deafening that conversations in nearby bunkers were impossible without hand signals. Every button, valve, and sensor was controlled remotely. The technicians watched their creation through periscopes and closed-circuit screens, knowing that a single crack in the shielding could turn their workplace into a death trap. The first Tory IA test, in 1961, had proven the concept. The second, Tory IC, would determine whether the engine could survive continuous operation. As the date approached, tension settled over the camp like desert heat. Radiation badges were checked twice a day, medical teams rehearsed emergency evacuations, and the cafeteria radios played patriotic songs to remind everyone that they were building something for peace. Yet in the quiet hours before each run, doubt crept in. Some scientists confided to their diaries that they felt they were crossing a moral event horizon. One engineer wrote that he could no longer look at the glowing reactor without imagining what it would do if launched over a city. The tests themselves were a spectacle of controlled chaos. When the compressors ignited, the desert floor trembled, rattling dust from the corrugated walls. Inside the bunker, indicator lights blinked like a Christmas tree. Airflow nominal, a voice would report, followed by the tense announcement, withdrawing control rods. The neutron counters spiked, then steadied. The power climbed higher, 10%, 20, 50. At full output, the reactor roared with a voice that seemed almost alive, a deep metallic howl that echoed across the mountains. Observers later recalled feeling a physical pressure in their chests, as if the air itself had turned to molten iron. When it was over, the compressors wound down, and silence returned with an almost sacred weight. The engineers filed out of the bunker to inspect the site, Geiger counters ticking in the breeze. The desert shimmered in the noon sun, faintly hazy from invisible particles carried downwind. A few dead jackrabbits near the fence line hinted at what that air now contained. Yet for all the unease, the data looked promising. The Tory reactor had run longer, hotter, and more stable than anyone dared hope. Within hours, the teletypes were clattering out victory reports to Washington. The Pentagon's reply was brief: proceed to weapons integration studies. That phrase changed everything. The scientists who had once dreamed of an aircraft now found themselves designing a missile. A machine that would fly not for hours, but for days, not to patrol, but to destroy. The project they had nurtured in the name of progress was being reborn as a weapon with no equal, a missile that carried its own apocalypse. In the barracks that night, as the desert wind swept over the silent test site, someone scribbled a note on a blackboard: "We've built the Dragon. Now someone has to decide if it should fly." By 1962, the monster they had built in the desert was ready to move. The laboratory jargon, nuclear ramjet propulsion testbed, was dropped for a name more fitting of myth. Project Pluto was no longer an experiment. It was a weapon program, fully sanctioned, lavishly funded, and cloaked in total secrecy. The ramjet engine they had birthed, Tory IA, was only the beginning. The next iteration, Tory IC, would prove that the engine could run continuously at power levels high enough to propel a supersonic missile halfway around the globe. The engineers who had once spoken cautiously about feasibility were now writing memos that used words like deployment and deterrence. At Jackass Flats, construction crews expanded the test facilities once again. New air compressors were installed, more powerful and more temperamental than the last generation. The reactor would now be fed air heated to nearly 600 degrees Celsius, rushing through its core at speeds exceeding Mach 3. It was a delicate dance of thermodynamics and terror. Any imbalance, too much airflow, too little control rod insertion, a microfracture in the ceramic fuel, could turn the experiment into a localized catastrophe. Yet the team pressed forward, driven by equal parts pride and fear that the Soviets might be doing the same thing somewhere beyond the Urals. The morning of May 14, 1964, dawned windless and bright. Across the desert, the mountains shimmered in the heat. In the bunker, 50 technicians took their places before the console panels, each a forest of dials and cathode ray displays. They had rehearsed the procedure for months, and now the countdown began. At 0, the compressors thundered to life. The airflow surged. Valves opened in sequence, and for a few tense seconds, the world held its breath. Then the neutron counters began to climb. Tori IC reached criticality in a smooth, steady rise, power surging through the core like a heartbeat. Outside, the engine screamed. Cameras recorded a shimmering distortion, the air itself bending with heat. A low, pulsing roar rolled over the desert, flattening the sparse grass and rattling the watchtower windows. Within the reactor, temperatures soared beyond 1,400 degrees Celsius, yet the fuel elements held. For 5 minutes, the nuclear ramjet ran flawlessly, no meltdown, no rupture, no loss of control. When the airflow finally ceased and the control rod slid home, the gauges sank back toward 0. The test was over. In the bunker, silence replaced the roar. Men who had spent years doubting that such a thing could even function simply stared at one another. A few cheered, but most were too stunned to speak. They had done it, they had made the atom fly. On paper, Tori IIC had delivered more than 35,000 pounds of thrust, enough to propel a missile at nearly 3 times the speed of sound. It was, in every measurable sense, a success. But outside the spreadsheets, the air was different. Radiation monitors around the site crackled angrily. The wind carried microscopic particles across miles of sagebrush. Even with precautions, some contamination spread beyond the perimeter. A safety officer later recalled that you could taste the metal in your mouth. The official report, however, downplayed the incident. It emphasized efficiency, output, and potential payload capacity. Within hours, copies of the report were on the desks of Pentagon analysts and Air Force generals. The response was immediate. Washington authorized the next phase, the development of an operational vehicle to carry the nuclear engine. It would not be a bomber, but a missile, the Supersonic Low-Altitude Missile, or SLAM. Its purpose was brutal in its simplicity. It would fly for days at treetop height, dropping hydrogen bombs along its route, and finally crash itself into an enemy target, scattering its own radioactive guts as a parting gift. In one stroke, the concept of a flying nuclear reactor became the foundation of the most apocalyptic weapon ever designed. Back in Nevada, the engineers watched as their project shifted from science to strategy. Security around the site doubled. Visitors from the Pentagon arrived with polished shoes and empty expressions. The men who had once spoken of innovation now used phrases like lethality index and target coverage. The change was unmistakable. The spirit of exploration had curdled into something far colder. One of the scientists wrote in his notebook that night, "We have succeeded beyond reason. The question now is whether anyone will have the courage to stop us." When the Pentagon saw the numbers, it saw inevitability. The Tori reactor had proven a terrifying promise, a propulsion system that could sustain supersonic flight for hours on end, unbound by fuel and unconcerned with range. For strategists who thought in maps of retaliation and in contingencies for devastation, that promise translated instantly into a plan far darker than patrols or deterrence. If a ramjet could run forever, then why not make it a delivery system for unthinkable harm? Thus, in quiet war rooms and behind locked doors, the idea of SLAM, the supersonic low-altitude missile, crystallized into a doctrine rather than a design, a weapon that would not merely strike, but systematically erase the possibility of safe habitation across wide swathes of enemy territory. The proposed profile of SLAM read like a dossier from a nightmare. It would fly at treetop height to evade radar, at speeds approaching Mach 3, carrying an array of hydrogen bombs that could be released along a pre-programmed path. Its nuclear-powered engine would give it endurance measured in days rather than hours, enabling it to crisscross continents, search for targets, and, if commanded, carpet a region with both blast and fallout. Finally, the missile itself, unrecoverable, unreturning, would dive into a final strike, its reactor rupturing and scattering radioactive material as it ended. In military calculus, this was efficiency, a single, autonomous weapon that could generate destruction far beyond any conventional delivery system. In moral terms, it was a catastrophe planned in advance. Designers in the program used colder language. They spoke of target coverage, probability of kill, and redundant release systems. Simulations, run on the primitive computers of the era, mapped hypothetical flight paths, civilian population densities, and fallout trajectories. The results were unambiguous. SLAM could, in certain scenarios, render entire regions uninhabitable for years, contaminate agricultural lands, and create fallout corridors that would travel with prevailing winds into neutral countries. Some briefs even suggested that the missile's weight could be used as an area denial mechanism, a radiological barrier that would prevent follow-on forces or reconstruction. When those maps circulated among senior officers, some stroked their chins and nodded, others shut the folders and left the room. Inside the laboratories, the mood swung between awe and revulsion. Engineers who had once relished the challenge of keeping a reactor stable at extreme temperatures now grappled with the uses to which their work was being put. Memoirs written years later describe conversations where colleagues debated whether the mere existence of such a weapon would make war safer by deterring aggression, or whether it would lower the threshold for conflict by providing a supposedly surgical but in reality indiscriminate tool of mass contamination. A few scientists found the language of deterrence hollow when juxtaposed with images of irradiated farmland and sick children. Others argued that, if the alternative was nuclear annihilation in a full exchange, then any system that preserved second strike capability could be justified. Publicly, the program continued beneath a veil of euphemism. Classified memos shortened catastrophic scenarios to sterile blips on status reports, and congressional oversight panels received carefully redacted briefings emphasizing technical hurdles and testing timetables rather than human costs. Yet whispers and leaks, small, scattered, began to reach people with influence. A handful of policymakers, briefed at the highest level, expressed alarm at the strategic and ethical implications. There were sober debates about international law, about whether a weapon designed to spread long-lasting contamination violated emergent norms of warfare, and about the diplomatic fallout if such capability were disclosed to allies or adversaries. Across the world, if intelligence analysts in Moscow pieced together the outlines of the program, they kept their own counsel. The mere possibility that the United States was developing a self-sustaining nuclear propulsion weapon added another layer to an already brittle global calculus. Deterrence is a conversation between threats and perceptions. SLAM, even as rumor, widened that conversation into new desperation. For a brief, dangerous moment, the Cold War risked evolving from a standoff of fear into a competition to possess instruments that could unmake the conditions of life itself. Back at Jackass Flats, as plans shifted from prototypes to weaponization, the engineers began to feel the human weight of abstract diagrams. Safety briefings multiplied, ethical memos circulated in locked mailboxes. Men who had once boasted about solving impossible equations now found themselves asking quieter questions. What if the missile missed? What if a crash occurred over friendly soil? What if a rogue operator changed a flight plan? The answers were always partial and never comforting. In some offices, practical doubts converged with moral ones, and a different argument gained traction: technological obsolescence. Ballistic missile development was accelerating. Intercontinental missiles promised faster, cleaner delivery without the radiological trail. If missiles could be made cheap enough, reliable enough, and numerous enough, then the strategic utility of a weapon like SLAM might be fleeting. That possibility offered a way out, a rational, if bureaucratic, path to cancellation that appealed to budgeters and cautious commanders alike. For the moment, however, those doubts were only a counterpoint to the drumbeat of progress. Plans advanced, budgets were authorized, and the desert facilities expanded. The weapon from hell was no longer merely a thought experiment. It was becoming a program with contractors, schedules, and a terrifying momentum all its own. As the calendar turned toward the mid-1960s, Project Pluto ceased to be merely a technical challenge and became, in the eyes of many who worked on it, a moral crucible. Inside the concrete bunkers and sterile offices, quiet conversations grew sharper. Men who had once taken pride in pushing the limits of science began to keep different records, personal journals, off-the-record memos, and letters home that hinted at unease. Some argued that the very logic of deterrence had reached a grotesque extreme: to guarantee peace by building a tool designed to make peace impossible afterwards. Others countered that the world's survival depended on options no one wished to use, and that engineers were merely instruments of policy, not philosophers. The tension surfaced in meetings with civilian overseers and military planners. Ethicists were absent from those rooms. The debates were framed in dollars, timelines, and casualty estimates. A staff psychologist later remembered watching otherwise jovial engineers fall into somber silence when confronted with fallout maps showing entire regions rendered unproductive for decades. One operations officer asked bluntly whether a weapon that could deny territory with radiation might itself become an engine of terror if misused. In response, a senior analyst produced a spreadsheet projecting how SLAM could disrupt enemy command and control and thereby reduce overall casualties in a hypothetical exchange. The exchange felt clinical, abstractions traded as if human life were a set of inputs on a chart. Outside the program, the country's political conversation was shifting too. The Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 had demonstrated how close the world could come to nuclear catastrophe, and the memory of those 13 days lingered in lawmakers' minds. Activists, journalists, and a new wave of scientists, some former colleagues, began to question the unchecked expansion of nuclear arsenals. While Project Pluto remained secret from the public, the cultural atmosphere had changed. An era of unquestioned faith in technological triumph gave way to a dawning awareness of consequence. In whispered corridors of power, a few senior officials wondered whether weapons that rendered swathes of the earth uninhabitable might one day undermine the very political order they were designed to defend. Within the Pentagon, those doubts created institutional fissures. The Air Force and the Atomic Energy Commission had, for years, operated as partners in a project that blurred the lines between civilian science and military necessity. But as the implications of SLAM's operational profile became clearer, bureaucratic resistance emerged. Some within the AEC fretted over the environmental liabilities of broad contamination. Career civil servants worried about long-term health effects for populations downwind of a deployed system. In congressional oversight hearings, officials asked awkward questions about safety margins and contingency planning, questions that could not be fully answered without exposing the program's core design. For the first time, the cloak of secrecy began to chafe. The human cost sharpened the debate further. Technicians who had once accepted a degree of occupational risk began to fear chronic radiation exposure and the moral burden of building a weapon that would inflict irreversible harm on civilians. One senior scientist recounted an argument in which a younger colleague asked whether the end truly justified the means, only to be told that moral calculus belonged to policymakers, not to men on the shop floor. That dismissal hardened resolve in some and hardened consciences in others. A small but steady current of dissent formed, not as public protest but as internal resistance, delayed memos, cautious recommendations, and an insistence on further environmental studies that, while technically defensible, also bought time. At the same time, pragmatism offered an escape hatch. Technological developments in ballistic missiles and submarine launch systems were accelerating. They promised faster delivery with far fewer radiological contingencies. Budget analysts pointed out that SLAM required enormous expense for diminishing strategic return once ICBMs matured. For pragmatists in the Air Force and the Department of Defense, this was an argument grounded in survivability and fiscal sense rather than ethics. If a cheaper, cleaner option provided equivalent deterrence, why pursue a weapon that could create uncontrollable fallout? The conversations coalesced into a slow bureaucratic pushback. Requests for expanded testing were met with tighter review. Environmental impact assessments, previously perfunctory, were extended and cross-checked. Pivotal voices within the AEC and the Air Force began to counsel restraint, citing both moral hazard and obsolescence. In private, some program leaders acknowledged that the project's political capital had waned. In public, they continued to tout progress. By the time internal memos began arriving on Capitol Hill suggesting pauses and further study, the momentum that had once carried Project Pluto forward had begun to lose its force. The moral questions, once background noise in engineering reports, had moved to the center of decision-making. Whether those questions would be decisive remained uncertain, but for the first time, the men who had forged the reactor found their technical bravado tempered by doubt, and the desert that had echoed with the roar of tests now waited, as if breathless, for a verdict not dictated by physics but by conscience. By 1963, the winds of technology had shifted. The world that had once seemed desperate for a nuclear-powered bomber or ramjet was now in the thrall of a new weapon, the intercontinental ballistic missile. What had been theoretical just a few years earlier, the ability to launch a nuclear warhead across continents in minutes, was now a fact of strategy. The Atlas had flown, the Titan had followed, and the Minuteman, rising from silos in the American Midwest, promised instant retaliation at the turn of a key. For the generals and policymakers watching the evolving balance of terror, this was the future, fast, controllable, and, by comparison, clean. Inside the corridors of the Pentagon, Project Pluto began to look like an artifact from a fever dream. The idea of a nuclear-powered missile roaming endlessly over the horizon no longer fit the tempo of the arms race. Why gamble with radioactive propulsion when solid-fueled missiles could deliver the same devastation in half an hour and leave no trail of fallout behind them? Yet bureaucracies rarely die cleanly. The Air Force continued to fund Jackass Flats, if only to preserve a hedge against uncertainty. As one official put it, better to have it and not need it, than to need it and not have it. The engineers, meanwhile, found themselves in a strange limbo, still designing, still testing, but increasingly aware that history was overtaking them. In the desert, work continued with an air of forced purpose. Tauri IIC's success had proven the concept. The next iteration, Tauri IID, aimed to refine control systems and extend endurance. But morale was different now. The once electric excitement that had animated the laboratories was replaced by a slow, bureaucratic grind. Budgets tightened. Supply deliveries came late. Visitors from Washington spoke less about the future of flight and more about phased drawdowns and long-term fiscal sustainability. Behind closed doors, project managers confided that they were no longer sure whether they were building a weapon, a research exhibit, or a monument to human arrogance. Outside, the world was transforming at a pace no one in 1950 could have imagined. The Cuban Missile Crisis had come and gone, leaving scars on both sides of the Iron Curtain. The Test Ban Treaty of 1963 outlawed atmospheric nuclear detonations, signaling the first global step toward restraint. Satellites now orbited the Earth, offering early warning of missile launches, another blow to the idea of an unstoppable, unseen nuclear vehicle. Even the press, though unaware of Pluto itself, had begun to question the wisdom of open-air atomic experiments. Public appetite for anything nuclear was waning. The age of fascination was giving way to the age of fear. Within the laboratories, the engineers could read the writing on the walls. Some shifted to other programs: space propulsion, reactor miniaturization, nuclear-powered electricity. Others stayed on out of loyalty, determined to see their creation reach one last milestone before it vanished into history. They told themselves that pure research was its own justification, that understanding how to run a reactor in supersonic airflow might someday serve peaceful purposes. It was a comforting fiction, and they clung to it as the political winds changed direction. Meetings in Washington grew colder, more transactional. The Air Force's Strategic Air Command argued that the Pluto missile's range advantage was redundant in a world of global ICBM coverage. The State Department warned that even testing such a system risked international outrage if contamination spread beyond U.S. borders. Environmental scientists, emboldened by the growing public concern over fallout, began circulating quiet warnings about cumulative contamination in Nevada and Utah. The debate had shifted from military need to public optics and liability. And yet, for all the skepticism, cancellation was never a simple decision. Too many careers, too many reputations, too many classified contracts were entangled with the project. To shut it down meant admitting that billions had been spent chasing a technological mirage. So the program lingered, funded just enough to keep the lights on, producing progress reports that promised additional data forthcoming and preliminary findings of continued feasibility. It was a slow fade, the kind only government secrecy can sustain. But among those who had seen the reactor roar to life, who had watched the desert shimmer under its radioactive breath, the realization was already clear. The world was moving on. Missiles had replaced bombers, silos had replaced hangars, and deterrence had become a mathematical equation, not an engineering challenge. Project Pluto, once heralded as the dawn of a new age, was becoming its own ghost. Still, deep in the Nevada desert, the test stands remained, silent under the sun, their metal frames rusting in the dry air. The scientists kept their notebooks and their doubts. Officially, the project was under review. Unofficially, it was dying. By the spring of 1964, the writing was carved into every classified memo: Project Pluto was running out of time. The world had changed faster than its creators could adapt. The dawn of the intercontinental missile had rendered the flying reactor, once imagined as the ultimate deterrent, an expensive curiosity. And yet, before it could be buried, the Air Force demanded one last demonstration. The men who had lived and breathed the program for nearly a decade gathered in the desert to prove, if only once more, that their creation could truly fly, if not through the sky, then at least through history. The test reactor, Tory IIC, was mounted once again on its steel pedestal at Jackass Flats. Around it rose the remnants of a decade's ambition: the cooling towers, the air compressors, the command bunkers half buried in the sand. Dust covered the signs that once read radiation zone, authorized personnel only. For the engineers who had arrived years earlier as young men, this final test carried a strange melancholy. Many had already been reassigned to missile and space projects. A few had quietly retired, their careers having reached both their peak and their moral limit inside these fences. Now, as they prepared the last firing sequence, they knew that when the roar faded, so would their chapter of the atomic age. On May 20th, 1964, at 6:57 a.m., the compressors spun to life for the last time. The desert shook as the massive turbines forced a torrent of air through the reactor's ceramic core. In the control bunker, technicians in white shirts and black ties leaned over analog dials that jittered under their fingertips. "Airflow nominal," a voice called out. "Begin withdrawal of control rods." Slowly, the numbers climbed. Radiation counters ticked faster. A faint tremor passed through the concrete floor. Then, from beyond the reinforced glass, came that unmistakable, impossible sound, the bellow of a nuclear engine breathing open air. For a few glorious minutes, Toriic burned like a man-made sun. Its exhaust plume warped the horizon. The temperature inside the core exceeded anything yet recorded in a mobile reactor. The machine worked, beautifully, horribly, perfectly. The men in the control room cheered, but their applause faded quickly, swallowed by the deep growl of fission. When the shutdown sequence began and the airflow ceased, silence fell heavy as ash. The counters slowed, the vibration faded, and only the smell of hot metal lingered. In that silence, a collective understanding settled over the room. They had succeeded, but there was nowhere left to go. Within weeks, the Pentagon issued its verdict. Project Pluto was to be terminated. Officially, the reasons were pragmatic: budget cuts, shifting priorities, the maturity of missile technology. Unofficially, it was also a decision of conscience. No one could imagine flight tests that wouldn't risk spreading radioactive contamination across the western states or over the Pacific. Even the most ardent advocates admitted that deploying such a weapon would be an ecological and diplomatic catastrophe. The Dragon had been built, but unleashing it would scorch its master as well as its enemies. The shutdown was quiet, almost funereal. Reactors were defueled, components sealed in drums and shipped to storage. The test stands were fenced off, their metal frames left to rust in the wind. Workers scraped radioactive residue from the walls, packed up their instruments, and left the desert behind. By the end of the year, Jackass Flats was silent except for the buzz of cicadas and the whisper of hot air moving through empty tunnels. For the men who had given years to the project, the end brought both relief and grief. They had achieved what physics deemed impossible, yet their triumph would never be celebrated. Everything they built was classified, buried under the weight of secrecy and guilt. Some found new work designing safer reactors for submarines and spacecraft. Others drifted away from nuclear science entirely, unable to reconcile what they had created. A few continued to believe that their efforts had kept the Cold War cold, that by building a weapon too terrible to use, they had ensured it would never be built again. When government auditors finally reviewed the project, the conclusion was brief, technically successful, strategically unnecessary. That phrase became Pluto's epitaph. The files were archived, the blueprints sealed, and the world moved on to new frontiers: rockets, satellites, computers, each promising salvation through technology, just as Pluto once had. Today, the remains of Project Pluto still lie scattered across the Nevada desert: rusted pipes, cracked concrete, traces of radiation in the soil. They are monuments not to victory, but to the limits of ambition, to the moment when humanity looked into the atomic abyss and saw not just power, but reflection. The flying nuclear reactor never took to the skies. Yet in its brief, burning existence, it revealed something profound: that the greatest danger of the nuclear age was never the bomb itself, but the belief that no idea was too dangerous to pursue. In the years that followed, Project Pluto slipped quietly into the vaults of forgotten history. Its documents were stamped classified, its test footage locked in archives few would ever open. Yet the shadow it cast lingered, an unspoken reminder of how far the Cold War had driven the human imagination. For a time, even those who had worked on it avoided speaking of it. They moved on to space programs, reactor designs, and new technologies that promised progress without the acrid taste of fallout. But somewhere, in the back of their minds, they carried the memory of the desert roaring with nuclear breath, and of the question that none of them had truly answered: how far is too far? Though the world never saw a nuclear-powered bomber take flight, the lessons of Pluto rippled through other frontiers. Techniques developed for its compact reactor core informed the early designs for nuclear submarines and deep space propulsion systems. Los Alamos engineers reused mathematical models once meant for the Tory engine to design safer, closed-cycle reactors for spacecraft, machines that could power voyages to the moon and beyond without releasing radiation into the atmosphere. In a strange twist of fate, knowledge born from an apocalyptic weapon helped fuel the space age's most peaceful dreams. It was a quiet redemption, though few dared call it that. Historians who later pieced together the story saw Pluto not as an outlier, but as a product of its time. The late 1950s were an age intoxicated by the idea that technology could conquer anything: distance, fear, even conscience. Nuclear energy promised miracles: homes powered by tiny reactors, cars that never refueled, rockets that could cross the solar system. Against that backdrop, a flying reactor seemed merely the next logical step. Yet as the decade ended, logic gave way to dread. The same science that promised progress now threatened survival. Pluto embodied that pivot, the moment when optimism curdled into anxiety, when human brilliance outpaced human restraint. Within the Pentagon, the project became a cautionary tale whispered among planners. Its code name appeared in briefings about unbounded escalation risk and psychological thresholds. What frightened them was not just the weapon's power, but its indifference: a machine that could fly without pilots, decide nothing, feel nothing, and poison everything in its path. To the strategists who had once demanded invincibility, Pluto revealed the moral cost of achieving it. It marked the edge where deterrence ceased to be rational and became theological, a faith in destruction as salvation. Environmental scientists, too, would later look back at Jackass Flats with unease. Surveys decades after the shutdown found traces of radiation still embedded in the soil, faint but stubborn, immune to time and wind. The desert had healed on the surface, but beneath the dust, Pluto's ghost remained. When declassified photographs surfaced in the 1980s, grainy images of the reactor glowing white-hot, men in lead aprons watching from behind glass, public reaction was a mixture of fascination and disbelief. Few had imagined that such an engine had ever existed outside science fiction. Even fewer could comprehend that it had been tested in open air, less than 200 miles from Las Vegas. For the veterans of the program, those revelations were bittersweet. Some felt vindicated that their work was finally acknowledged, even if briefly. Others felt exposed. Interviews recorded in their later years show a mixture of pride and remorse. "We proved it could be done," one engineer said, "but we never stopped to ask whether it should be." Another, when asked what he felt seeing the photos again, paused for a long time before answering, "It looks magnificent. And completely insane." As time softened the edges of secrecy, Project Pluto joined the growing catalogue of Cold War paradoxes, a symbol of both genius and hubris. Scholars debated its meaning. Was it an example of deterrence pushed beyond reason, or an experiment that, by failing to deploy, quietly saved the world from a worse fate? Perhaps it was both. For all its madness, the project had forced nations to confront the boundaries of their own survival instincts, to acknowledge that not every idea that can fly deserves wings. Today, the ruins of Jackass Flats still stand under the Nevada sun, their concrete shells bleaching slowly in the heat. Tourists are not allowed, but satellite images reveal the ghostly outlines of test stands and trenches half buried in sand. On rare occasions, researchers in protective suits walk the site, measuring radiation that persists like a faint heartbeat. They call it legacy data. But for those who remember, it is something else, a relic of an age when fear and imagination were indistinguishable, when men built monsters not out of malice, but out of the conviction that only monsters could keep other monsters away. Project Pluto never flew, but its echo endures, in the moral architecture of every nuclear treaty, in the restraint behind every red button, and in the haunting knowledge that once, in a lonely desert, mankind came perilously close to teaching the atom to fly. The Nevada desert is silent now. The tunnels at Jackass Flats have long since cooled, their walls covered in dust the color of bone. The air that once trembled with the roar of the Tory reactor now carries only the wind, soft, indifferent, endless. Standing there today, it's almost impossible to imagine that this barren valley was once the threshold of a new world. Yet buried beneath its surface lies the story of a dream that came too close to nightmare the moment humanity tried to make the atom soar, and nearly succeeded. From the air, the remains are barely visible, just faint geometric scars etched into the earth, visible only to satellites and the few who know what to look for. Concrete pads, rusted pipes, and the ghost outlines of test bunkers stare up at the sky like forgotten prayers. In the archives, yellowed film reels still show the tests, the trembling reactor, the boiling air, the men behind glass counting down to history. There's a strange beauty to it, even now, an image of human ambition at its brightest and most dangerous. For those who built it, Project Pluto was not simply a weapon, it was proof that there were no longer any boundaries between imagination and power. But time has a way of humbling even the most defiant visions. In the decades since, the idea of a flying nuclear reactor has become an object lesson rather than a goal. It appears in textbooks and documentaries as a warning of the moment when progress forgot to ask why. Each generation of scientists inherits that question anew, whether in artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, or new forms of energy. The lesson of Pluto whispers beneath them all: invention is easy, restraint is the hardest thing we learn. Looking back, it's clear that Project Pluto was not born of cruelty, but of fear, a fear so vast that reason bent beneath it. The men who built it were not villains. They were brilliant, devoted, and sincere. They believed that by creating the ultimate deterrent, they might prevent a war that could end civilization. And in a cruel paradox, they were right, the Cold War never turned hot. Yet their creation stood as a reminder that the line between protection and destruction is perilously thin, and that sometimes the tools we forge for safety are indistinguishable from those we fear most. When the files were declassified decades later, readers were struck by how close the world had come to crossing an invisible threshold. The documents contained blueprints, test logs, and memos written in the unremarkable language of bureaucracy, phrases like nominal performance achieved and contamination acceptable within parameters. Yet between those lines lay a story of awe and terror, humanity's first attempt to give fission wings, to let the atom roam free across the sky. It is perhaps fortunate that the dream ended where it did, before the desert wind could carry its breath beyond the fences. At sunset, the Nevada hills still glow a deep copper red. The wind moves over the cracked earth where engineers once stood in lead aprons and heavy gloves, squinting against the heat. The sound they heard that day, the howl of a nuclear engine breathing open air, has never been heard again. Perhaps that is for the best. For while the world owes much to those who dared to explore the unknown, it owes even more to those who chose to stop. History is often written by those who act. Yet sometimes, the future is preserved by those who refuse. And in that desert, beneath the pale sky of an anxious century, humanity looked at what it had built, felt the weight of its own brilliance, and quietly decided that some things were not meant to fly.